The HFY Council had banned human music across all compact-administered worlds within 9 days of its first documented cultural impact assessment, a legislative response speed no other cultural product in 300 years of interspecies contact had ever provoked. And Councillor Vesa Oren would spend the following 2 years trying to explain to increasingly skeptical colleagues why silencing a species' songs had turned out to be the single worst strategic decision of her considerable political career. It began, as these things often do, with something the Council's Cultural Integration Office initially classified as a minor curiosity rather than a genuine threat. Human musical exports, distributed informally across compact-administered space through the modest cultural exchange programs that had accompanied Earth's early, tentative integration into the wider galactic community, had begun generating listener engagement statistics that the Council's own analytics division flagged as statistically anomalous within the first 3 months of tracking. Not merely popular, in the way that novel cultural products from any newly contacted species sometimes generated temporary curiosity before fading into unremarkable background noise. Something closer to what the analytics division's own internal report, later leaked and extensively studied, described as sustained, escalating engagement inconsistent with typical cross-species cultural adoption curves. Councillor Vesa Oren, serving at the time as the Council's junior cultural affairs representative, had been assigned to investigate the phenomenon as a routine administrative matter, expecting, based on considerable prior experience with cross-species cultural exchange, a straightforward assessment that would conclude, as most such assessments did, with a mildly interesting but ultimately unremarkable footnote about human artistic expression. What she found instead, across 3 months of increasingly thorough investigation, unsettled her considerably more than her initial assignment had prepared her to expect. The engagement pattern is not merely unusual, she reported to the full Council, presenting data that had, by that point, generated genuine alarm across multiple compact administrative departments. It is producing measurable physiological and behavioral effects across every species we have been able to study, affects our own considerable research into cross-species cultural products, has never previously documented at this scale or consistency. Threxel citizens exposed to human musical compositions show elevated emotional response markers considerably beyond what any prior cultural product has produced, alongside documented instances of what our Psychological Assessment Division has classified as involuntary emotional catharsis, individuals experiencing unexpected and, in several documented cases, socially disruptive emotional release during ordinary daily activities, triggered specifically by exposure to human musical compositions. High Councillor Osvek Thane, whose considerable political career had been built substantially around careful, methodical governance of exactly the kind of cultural stability the Council's entire administrative structure existed to protect, pressed for clarification regarding the phenomenon's actual strategic significance. "You are suggesting human musical exports represent some form of psychological weapon," he said, "deliberately engineered to produce destabilizing emotional response across the compact's citizen population." "I do not believe it is deliberate, Councillor," Vesa said, though her own uncertainty regarding the phenomenon's actual mechanism was, by that point in her investigation, genuinely considerable. "I have found no evidence whatsoever that humanity's musical exports were specifically engineered as any form of cultural or psychological weapon against the compact. I believe, based on considerable subsequent research, that we are observing something considerably more complicated and considerably more difficult to properly categorize within our existing cultural integration doctrine. Human musical composition appears to access something in the neurological and emotional architecture shared, apparently, across a remarkably wide range of compact species, something our own species' cultural traditions have simply never developed the capacity to trigger with comparable intensity or consistency. The Council's decision to formally ban human musical distribution across compact administered space, ratified 9 days after Vesa Oren's initial preliminary report, reflected the particular institutional caution that had governed Threxel cultural policy across 3 centuries of careful, deliberate expansion, a caution that treated any cultural product generating measurable, unpredictable psychological effects as a genuine administrative risk requiring immediate, decisive containment. We do not yet understand the mechanism, High Counselor Thane explained during the formal announcement of the ban, and a council that does not understand a phenomenon's mechanism cannot responsibly permit its continued, unrestricted distribution across a citizen population whose psychological stability represents this council's most fundamental governing responsibility. This ban is not a permanent judgment against human artistic expression. It is a necessary precaution, pending further research into effects our own considerable cultural science has never previously encountered. Vesa Oren's own private assessment of the decision, which she did not share publicly given her junior position within the Council's considerable political hierarchy, carried a specific unease she would only fully articulate years later, once the ban's actual consequences had become impossible for even the Council's most cautious members to continue ignoring. The ban proved, within weeks of its formal implementation, almost entirely unenforceable, a practical reality that Vesa Oren's own considerable understanding of compact administrative capability had genuinely predicted from the outset, though her warnings to that effect had received insufficient weight within the Council's initial, hastily convened deliberation. Human musical compositions, distributed initially through official cultural exchange channels the ban had specifically targeted, had already, within the brief window between initial cultural contact and the Council's formal prohibition, propagated across informal networks that compact administrative capability had never previously needed to monitor or restrict, a reality that reflected something Vesa's subsequent research would identify as a specific, unanticipated consequence of banning a cultural product that had already achieved genuine, organic emotional resonance across multiple species populations. You cannot unring a bell that citizens have already decided matters to them, she told the Council, 6 months into an enforcement effort that had, by that point, generated considerably more political and administrative complication than the original phenomenon it had been designed to contain. Our enforcement division has identified over 400,000 documented instances of unauthorized human musical distribution across compact space within the ban's first 6 months alone, a violation rate our considerable prior experience with restricted cultural material has never previously encountered at this scale. I do not believe this reflects inadequate enforcement resources, counselors. I believe it reflects a citizen population that has, in the brief period before our ban's implementation, already decided that whatever human musical composition provides them matters considerably more than this Council's administrative caution, and that decision, once genuinely made across a population this large, cannot be effectively reversed through conventional restriction. The ban's most significant unintended consequence, which Vesa Oren's continued research would eventually document in exhaustive detail across the following 18 months, was not, as the Council had originally feared, some form of ongoing psychological destabilization requiring continued administrative intervention. It was instead something considerably more politically consequential, a rapidly growing perception across multiple compact species populations that the Council's own governing authority had, for the first time in 3 centuries of generally well-regarded administration, chosen to restrict access to something citizens genuinely, deeply valued, Without providing an explanation, those citizens found remotely adequate to justify the restriction. Public sentiment analysis indicates measurable decline in council approval across every major population center we have surveyed, reported Threl Vasson, the council's public sentiment coordinator, presenting data 11 months into the ban's implementation that had, by that point, become impossible for even the council's most institutionally cautious members to continue dismissing. Citizens do not appear to accept the council's official justification regarding unstudied psychological risk as sufficient reason for continued restriction. Sentiment data suggests a growing perception that the ban reflects excessive administrative caution rather than genuine, evidence-based safety concern, a perception that is, itself, generating measurable erosion in broader public trust regarding this council's governing judgment. Vesa Oren, whose own considerable research into the actual phenomenon underlying human musical composition's unusual emotional resonance had, across the preceding 18 months, evolved from cautious professional investigation into something considerably closer to genuine personal fascination, presented the council with a comprehensive final assessment that would eventually prove instrumental in the ban's formal reversal. I have spent 18 months attempting to properly understand why human musical composition produces the specific, measurable emotional response our initial investigation documented, she said, addressing a council session convened specifically to reconsider the ban's continued strategic viability. I believe I have finally developed an adequate answer, though I confess it required considerably more genuine humility regarding our own species' cultural limitations than my initial investigation anticipated requiring. Human musical tradition, developed across their entire recorded history through what appears to be a deliberate, sustained cultural investment our own species never developed to comparable depth, has cultivated a specific artistic capacity to encode complex emotional experience directly into structured sound. In a manner that appears to bypass conventional cognitive processing and access something considerably more foundational in the shared neurological architecture across a remarkably wide range of sentient species. This is not a weapon, counselors, deliberately or otherwise. It is simply a genuinely rare and genuinely valuable cultural achievement, one that happens to resonate across species boundaries in a manner our own considerable cultural science has never previously encountered from any other civilization's artistic tradition. We did not encounter a psychological threat requiring containment. We encountered something considerably rarer, a form of artistic expression capable of communicating genuine emotional truth across the boundaries that normally separate one species' inner experience from another's. And we responded to that rare, genuine value by banning it, out of an abundance of caution our own citizens. It turns out, were considerably less willing to accept than this council originally assumed they would be. The formal ban's reversal, ratified 2 years after its original implementation, arrived alongside a considerably more extensive cultural exchange framework, specifically designed to formally incorporate human musical tradition into the compact's broader cultural integration programs. A policy shift that Vesa Oren, promoted by that point to senior cultural affairs counselor substantially on the strength of her extensive research into the original phenomenon, would characterize. In her own formal closing report on the entire episode, as one of the most significant strategic corrections in the Council's considerable recent history. We banned something because we did not understand it, and we did not understand it because we assumed, based on 3 centuries of generally successful cultural governance, that any cultural product capable of producing measurable psychological effect, this significant must represent some kind of risk requiring careful administrative containment, she wrote, in the report's closing assessment. What we failed to properly consider, across those initial 9 days of hurried deliberation, was that not every powerful cultural force represents a threat to be managed. Some represent, instead, a genuine gift, one that happened to arrive from a species whose particular historical and cultural development had cultivated an artistic capacity our own considerable civilization had simply never developed to comparable depth. Humanity did not weaponize music against us, counselors, however alarming our initial data appeared. They simply created something genuinely, remarkably good, something capable of reaching across the considerable boundaries that normally separate one species' emotional experience from another's, and offered it to us freely, through the same cultural exchange programs we used to share considerably less remarkable cultural products with dozens of other compact member species. We responded to that gift with suspicion and restriction. And it took us 2 years, and a considerable erosion in this council's own public standing, to understand that some of the most valuable things one civilization can offer another are not weapons requiring careful defensive management. They are simply beautiful, and beauty, it turns out, does not require our permission to matter to the people who encounter it. Human musical distribution across compact space, in the years following the band's formal reversal, grew into one of the most extensively documented and genuinely celebrated aspects of the broader human-threxel-cultural relationship, a development that Vesa Oren, in her subsequent, considerably more senior role overseeing the Compact's expanded cultural integration programs, would continue to describe as the defining lesson of her entire political career. People still ask me sometimes why the council originally banned something as apparently harmless as music, she said, during a retrospective interview conducted years after the episode's formal conclusion, addressing an audience that included representatives from a dozen compact member species who had, by that point, developed their own genuine, considerable appreciation for human musical tradition. I think the honest answer is that we were afraid of something we didn't understand, and fear, when it's not properly examined, tends to reach for restriction as its first and easiest response. What we eventually learned, at real cost to this council's own public standing, is that some things are worth understanding before you decide they're dangerous. Humanity gave the wider galaxy something genuinely rare, an artistic tradition capable of communicating emotional truth across the boundaries that normally separate one species from another, and our first instinct, faced with something that powerful and that unfamiliar, was to lock it away until we felt safe again. I don't think that instinct was unreasonable, exactly, given everything this council is actually responsible for protecting. But I've come to believe it was wrong, in the way that caution sometimes is wrong, when it mistakes genuine beauty for genuine threat, simply because both are capable of moving an entire population more powerfully than anyone in a position of careful, deliberate governance, is always comfortable admitting they can be moved,